600 children who were abused.
Young, innocent, abused, some even tortured. A bombshell investigation, 60 years in the making, revealing a hellish past in Baltimore.
Of being sexually abused and raped as a 9-year-old boy by a Catholic priest.
The Archdiocese implicated, covering up pedophile priests. Now, generations of pain resurfacing. Will anyone be charged?
The sad reality is that Maryland law has tied my hands.
This is a special presentation from Scripps News, WMAR2 News, and the Baltimore Sun. Sins of the Fathers, Abuse and Betrayal in Baltimore. Now, from Baltimore, Kelly Swoop and Chance Seals.
Thank you for joining us for what will be an important but difficult conversation. I'm Kelly Swoop of WMAR2 News in Baltimore.
I'm Chance Seals of Scripps News, and we're here because over a 60-year period, at least 156 priests in the Archdiocese of Baltimore sexually abused, assaulted, even tortured more than 600 victims. And the church covered it up, allowing the abusers to continue. Perhaps more troublingly, some were elevated into positions of higher authority, like one who became the chaplain at an all-girls school here in Baltimore.
These are the findings of an extensive 4-year investigation by the Office of the Maryland Attorney General. The report concludes there are likely far more victims that never came forward. The current Archbishop of Baltimore, William Lori, called these failings a betrayal of trust. In a sermon on Easter Sunday, he said the church begs for forgiveness and asked the Lord to heal those who were harmed. Lori insists the church is different today. Promising allegations are reported to proper authorities outside the church.
In the hour ahead, Archbishop William Lori will not be here with us, though he has declined our repeated invitations extended over the past 3 weeks to participate in this program. In fact, the Archdiocese declined to make any other official available to be with us.
You will hear from other key people connected to the story, victims who endured the abuse, the team once inside the Attorney General's office who led the investigation, and journalists who are working every day to expose the painful reality, both past and present. And a warning, some of the language here is graphic.
And now we get to tell our story, and the world will listen, and the world will see that we were telling the truth.
6 decades, at least 156 priests and other clergy members, 600 victims of child sexual abuse. One damning picture of the Archdiocese of Baltimore, the oldest Roman Catholic archdiocese in the country. The country still processing the nearly 500-page report released last week by Maryland's Attorney General. It's partially redacted, meaning the identities of some still living clergy members were taken out. But many of the gut-wrenching details of the abuse remain spelled out in black and white.
What was consistent throughout the stories was the absolute authority and power these abusive priests and the church leadership held over survivors, their families, and their communities.
The investigation found some priests groomed victims with presents and special attention. Some told victims the abuse was God's will and that no one would doubt the word of a priest. Some even threatened the victim would go to hell if they told anyone what happened. But even in cases where it was reported, the abuse continued as the church engaged in a systemic cover-up. Some allegations were already known, like those against Joseph Maskell, a priest, a part of the Netflix series The Keepers. He was moved from 2 parishes in the late 1960s over his behavior with young children, described as sexual fantasies and fascinations, including with the Boy Scouts. Reports by parents were never investigated, as he was placed as a chaplain at the all-girls Archbishop Keough High School. He's accused of abusing 39 girls there, threatening some with a gun, showing pornography, fondling them, ejaculating on some, and raping others. Maskell was never charged and died in 2001.
When they let Joseph Maskell go, and 2 major systems, I feel, let him go, what they said to other predators was, as long as you don't get found out, you're good.
The majority of those named in the Attorney General's report were first outed 20 years ago when the Archdiocese of Baltimore released a list of, quote, credibly accused priests. That list is still in existence and includes 152 names, 39 fewer than the AG report. But officials believe the number of victims is actually much higher, as many might be afraid to come forward with their own stories. Baltimore Archbishop William Lori promised the report would not be ignored. He insists he's glad it's out, and he apologizes to the victims.
May this public accounting help to usher in an era of peace for people who were harmed, strength for our communities of faith, and restoration for the church in Maryland and beyond.
As the country comes to terms with what the investigation uncovered, there is already a change in state law. Maryland removed the statute of limitations on civil litigation in child sex abuse cases against institutions like the Archdiocese. But the statute of limitation on criminal cases appears to have expired, meaning the quest for justice will continue. With us now are some of the survivors of this abuse who have fought not only for the truth to be exposed, but for changes in the church and state law. Teresa Lancaster's abuse by Joseph Maskell started at the age of 16. Jean Hartigan-Weiner is also a survivor of Maskell. Both appeared in the Netflix series The Keepers. And David Lorenz is the director of the Maryland chapter of Survivors Network for those abused by priests. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Teresa, I wanted to start with you because something big just happened. The state legislature, after this report came out, passed a bill, and it pretty much strips away the statute of limitations on civil suits against the church. It was 38 years, I believe, before. Now, Wes Moore, the governor, just said that's gone.
Yes.
You actually earned your law degree after all of this, surviving this.
Yes.
How significant do you think that is?
I think it's a really big deal for several reasons. When I filed a lawsuit against the church back in '94, the church managed to get it thrown out on the technicality of the statute of limitations. They knew that it had merit. They knew we were speaking the truth, Jean and I. Yet they used the statute of limitations to hide behind, and they successfully got rid of our case, and that promoted Keeler up to Cardinal at the time.
Will you refile?
Yes, I plan to refile.
You do?
Yes, I do.
Okay. The Attorney General's report, it just lays out in horrific raw detail of this pattern of cover-ups from the Archdiocese. And there was a case, I want to make sure I get it right. Father Frederick Duke is his name. He spent nearly 20 years at the Shrine of the Little Flower here in Baltimore. A few of the cases here, 1953, it was 2 or 3 boys come forward and say, we've been abused. The Archbishop knows, does nothing. Fast forward, 1988, a now 47-year-old victim comes forward, says, I want to press charges. I want something done. I want to report this. The church goes to Duke, the priest, right? He admits 26 boys he abused between 1949 and 1961, including, and I'm sorry, this is graphic, but oral and anal rape. The AG's investigation uncovered notes in the Archdiocese files that they prepared for this interview with the victim. And I want to read a few of the statements that they were saying, hey guys, as we get ready for this, here's what we want to say. Quote, do not talk about any other children. We will deny any liability. Maybe we could say that we have nothing in our files. If a lawyer is present, express surprise. And quote, no history, nothing in files. Of course, we know there was a lot more than nothing in those files. In the end, this priest, he's off in retirement in a nursing home. He settles personally for $25,000. But you look at this, is this representative of how the church dealt with these allegations?
I believe that this is very emotional, because it is how they deal with it. How they deal with it. I came to my pastor in 1992 to let them know what I was remembering about 2 priests, Joseph Maskell and Neil Magnus. I was encouraged to speak to an archdiocesan representative. He said that they had never had a complaint of that type about Joseph Maskell. And he said that he was so intelligent, Joseph Maskell was so intelligent, that if they didn't have everything in place, and he put his fingers together and he said, he'll just fall right through our fingers. Now this was just the representative, my husband, my sister, and my pastor. Fast forward to this report. And they have insisted all the way through since 1992 that I was the first person to make a complaint of this type about Joseph Maskell. And on page, I believe it's 257, it's a grand jury, report that states that they knew of his behavior with children as early as 1966. So
you made this report in 92?
In 92.
And they knew back in 1966?
And continued on. I mean, these behaviors don't stop. So if by 1966 they understood what his behavior was like with children, and he was a priest all the way up, he was still active in 1992. We're talking about a lot of cover up, closing your eyes, moving him around. A lot was going on. And I was just remembering for the first time. So in answer to your question, I would say that I don't believe anything they say. It has solidified my understanding that they knew and lied right to me. My husband put the burden back on us and continued to all the way through until I saw what the report. I suspected, and now I know that they knew.
David, we've heard about cases like this in Philadelphia and Boston. What is it that makes Baltimore, I guess, unique that it was allowed to continue for so long?
Well, I don't know that Baltimore is that unique. We need to have investigations like this throughout the United States. You mentioned Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, and there's California, and there's Washington. And then, at one point, early on when it broke in Boston, right? The bishops came out and they said, this is an American problem. It's purely a U.S. problem. And then we find out that, they've done investigations in Ireland, Australia, Germany, France. France was just recent. And it's the same thing happening over there. And then they're doing investigations now in South America. It is not a U.S. problem. And it is, Baltimore is unique in that it's the latest one that I would say is found. And we need to do it everywhere. This kind of investigation needs to be done everywhere to allow survivors to see the truth about what they've been through, as Jean just talked about. That's unbelievably important to survivors. It helps other survivors come forward. We know, she talked about the tip of the iceberg. This 600 is probably 1/5 to 1/10 of the actual number of people who were actually abused. In fact, the report says so. Studies have been shown that. So there's really somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 abuse victims in the Diocese of Baltimore, and that should stagger anybody. That should make us all think, just really knock us on our tail, right?
Teresa, you actually printed out part of the report and brought it with you here for this discussion, and it's all those, we're talking about how deep and how expansive this report is, but you're upset about all those black lines, right?
Yeah, I'm about transparency and accountability, and right under where it says church leaders, all the names are blacked out. These are the people that enabled the abuse. These are the people that moved Father Maskell from Our Lady of Victory to Keogh. Our Lady of Victory, where he was abusing young boys. So maybe they figured an all-girls school would be safe. So it's incredible. I mean, they wanted us to believe they've changed. Where's the accountability? These people have, in my opinion, blood on their hands. I know people that didn't make it. And it's a horrible situation. And where, again, is the transparency? Do they care? And they say that they've changed. I get messages every day. There's a lot going on in South America. A lot of young people contact me and tell me if they come forward, they're afraid for their lives. So it is a church problem, and they need to clean house all over the world.
Well, we appreciate you guys joining us, for fighting for change and being here and being so brave to talk about this. Next, we'll examine more specific claims and find out the answer to the question, how did investigators uncover the truth The source of some of the incriminating documents may surprise you.
And we'll hear from the person who opened this investigation, former Attorney General Brian Frosh. It is his first extended interview since the report's release, and it's next.
The report seeks to document this long and sordid history.
That's current Attorney General of Maryland, Anthony Brown, who released the nearly 500-page report into sexual abuse and cover-up inside the Archdiocese of Baltimore. That abuse occurred over a 60-year period ending in the early 2000s. It involved more than 600 victims and likely hundreds more.
Attorney General Brown just took office this January. It was actually his predecessor, Brian Frosh, who began this investigation. He then fought for it to see the light of day. Brian Frosh joins us here for his first extended television interview since the report's release.
Also with us for the conversation, two journalists from the Baltimore Sun who have been at the forefront of the story. Lee Sanderlin covers state and federal law enforcement and federal courts. Gene Marabella is an investigative and enterprise reporter who has been with the Sun since 1987. So this is the first time we're hearing from you, Mr. Frosh, on television. What is your reaction to this report?
Well, my reaction to the report originally was shock and horror. It was a long labor. It took too long, and I feel bad for the survivors that it took as long as it did. But it was important. It had to be done. It was, as I said, horrifying. The scope of the abuse and the level of knowledge of the hierarchy in the Archdiocese of Baltimore were particularly disturbing.
I want to know more about why you began this. You got your investigators on it in 2019, but you said it took too long. Who took too long? Was it your office? Was it the Archdiocese?
There's a lot of blame to go around. I mean, our office took too long. We were under-resourced. We did the best we could with what we had. We got the last of the document production from the Catholic Church in the spring of last year. The report was completed 5 or 6 months later. It took a long time because there were massive amounts of information. There were hundreds of survivors and victims, and there were more than 150 abusers. And to run everything down and to get all the information took a very long time.
And you started it, why did you feel compelled to do it?
Well, I read portions of the report from the Attorney General's office in Pennsylvania, and that was shocking. And we started hearing from the victims and the survivors in Maryland and their families, and we heard from other folks around the state about the impacts of child abuse in general, and it seemed like somebody needed to take a hard look. It's ugly. It's unpleasant to read. It's not suitable for a family audience. But I think the truth needs to be told.
So back in 2018, when you decided to launch the investigation after the Pennsylvania report came out, was that the first time it occurred to you or your office that this was something that needed to be investigated in Maryland?
Yeah, it was. I mean, maybe I was naive or sheltered or whatever, but it had not occurred to me previously that this was something that we could or should do.
And looking back now, do you wish you had started sooner so you could have seen the report through and the aftermath and perhaps handled any prosecutions that resulted from it?
I certainly wish it could have been completed sooner. I wish I had had more people to put on it in order to get it done faster. And I regret the fact that it took as long as it did.
And one final thing on this, do you think more people should be prosecuted as a result of this report? I think there has been one case that came out of it, but there are 10 abusers who are still alive. Should someone consider charges against them?
I don't think I can comment on that, Gene. I apologize, but there's a confidentiality order, and I'm no longer in the Attorney General's office. I don't know what the state of play is, so I just don't think I can get into that.
You mentioned staffing and resources. I think it's been reported that you had about 2 people at a given time assigned to it. Did you go to the General Assembly or the Governor's office to seek more funding, more resources when you realized this was taking forever?
Well, the General Assembly did not have the power to do anything for us, and our budget kept getting cut by the governor. So I was struggling to keep all of my people in place. And we asked, but we're not surprised that we weren't fully staffed.
Something that was in the report that kind of, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Archbishop Lori's response, he's not with us tonight, but in his response Wednesday when it came out, he wrote in a pastoral letter, and this is the quote, "Having spent 4 years investigating the Archdiocese, former Attorney General Brian Frost signaled that the cultural changes, child protection policies, and accountability measures the Archdiocese began implementing more than a generation ago have proven successful." Do you agree with his assessment?
I think that too broadly construes something I said around the time that we filed our motion to disclose the report. And what I said was, as far as we could tell, the Archdiocese started complying with the law in 2002. Laws had been passed in Maryland requiring reporters, people who heard about child abuse, to report it to the law enforcement authorities. And as far as I can tell, the church did do that starting in 2002. I would not say that they have done everything they can since then to stop child abuse, to hold people accountable, et cetera. I don't know in large part.
Mr. Frost, in just a few minutes, 2 of the survivors are going to join us for this conversation. But Teresa was just here, and she held up this document. It looks like something from the NSA. It's completely redacted. It's just a block of black. You can't tell who is mentioned in this report. In some of these cases, we know 150 plus clergy members are identified, but about a dozen redactions because they're believed to be alive. Also, others who may be engaged in the cover-up. Do you believe any of those people still work in the Archdiocese of Baltimore?
I don't know for sure. I don't know what was redacted. And I mean, I know what was in the original report in its unredacted state, but I don't know what was blacked out. I haven't gone back to compare the two.
In the original report, were any of those people still working in the Archdiocese?
I don't think I can answer that question. There's a confidentiality order that applies specifically to the names that have been redacted, so I think I can't comment on that.
So, Mr. Frost, the Archdiocese currently runs like 60 schools throughout the Baltimore area,
right.
24,000 students. Is there still a threat or concern for parishioners or children at this point?
Well, I certainly hope not. I can't speak to how the schools are running today. I can tell you that as far as I know, when there are complaints about child abuse, they're being brought to law enforcement and they're being pursued. So putting that aside, I think it's reasonable to assume that the Catholic Church is doing a good job. They provide important services and education. And all I can say is I hope that the child abuse epidemic is behind them.
I want to read a portion of the report that came out from the AG's office for our viewers so they can hear it at home. Quote, "Leaders of the Archdiocese repeatedly dismissed reports of abuse and exhibited little to no concern for victims. They failed to adequately investigate complaints and made no effort to identify other victims or corroborate alleged abuse. They transferred known abusers to other positions of equal authority and access to children. They focused not on protecting victims or stopping the abuse, but rather on ensuring at all cost that the abuse be kept hidden. The cost and consequences of avoiding scandal were borne by the victimized children." Mr. Frost, based on the witnesses, I mean, those children are now adults and they're still so deeply impacted by this. You have the documents, you have the witnesses. Did you ever get a sense of why this concerted cover-up?
I don't know completely. I mean, they were clearly concerned about the financial impact on the church. They were settling cases occasionally for $10,000, $20,000 for kids who had been subjected to horrible abuse. I mean, if you've read the report, you know that not only were many of them raped and abused, but some were tortured, some were threatened. Teachers and priests were accused of holding a gun to the kid's head, sticking it in one girl's mouth and saying, "You tell anybody, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill your family." Milder threats like, "You're going to go to hell if you tell anybody."
Which is not mild to a kid, of course.
Of course not.
This is a person in authority. That's really scary.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. So I can't explain how internally they managed to create a culture of cover-up, but they did. I mean, kids would report abuse to one priest, and it turns out that priest was an abuser himself. Or they'd tell a teacher or a principal. And in one part of the report, I remember a young girl went to a nun and said, "Father so-and-so did something to me," and the nun smacked her in the face and said, "Never say anything like that about a priest." You know, they weren't believed.
Yeah.
Mr. Frosch, earlier you mentioned that the final document disclosure from the church came in June of last year. When your office announced its motion to disclose the report, the church immediately went and started paying lawyers for people who were hoping to keep their names out of it. Putting all this together, it would seem to me that the church is still fighting to keep this secret, to keep names out of it. I mean, is that your view? Did they slow walk all of this? Have they been obstructionist?
Let me say, I think they followed the law, but I think they took too long to produce the documents, and I think the protestations about them supporting its release are undermined by the fact that they are actually paying for the folks who are trying to stop its release and the ones who got the redactions.
We're going to take a quick break here, but we have more questions for you, like why you believe clusters of abusive priests appeared at certain parishes.
And two survivors are going to join us here at the table, including one you have not heard from yet this hour, and they're going to be part of the conversation with former Attorney General Brian Frosch right after this.
This is a special presentation from Scripps News, WMAR2 News, and the Baltimore Sun. Sins of the Fathers, Abuse and Betrayal in Baltimore. Here again, Kelly Swoop and Chance Seals.
The scale of abuse in Baltimore is staggering. It's 60 years, at least 156 priests, 600 victims, and a cover-up inside the Archdiocese of Baltimore that sustained for generations. The fullest picture yet of this problem finally revealed thanks to the tireless work of a team of investigators. Then Attorney General Brian Frosch launched it in 2019.
We began our conversation just before the break, and we want to pick up where we left off and welcome two survivors to the conversation. David Lorenz is back with us. He is the director of the organization that supports survivors of church abuse. And joining us for the first time tonight is Gloria Larkin. She was a driving force behind the campaign to launch this investigation. Thank you both of us for joining us.
Thank you.
And Mr. Frosch, you mentioned a few minutes ago that you seem to identify some clusters of where these abusive priests were located. And one of them, St. Mark Parish, Catonsville, it had 11, maybe 12 priests identified as abusers. 4 other parishes had 6 abusers each. And of course, people ask the Archdiocese, what's going on here? They push back, suggesting priests were not intentionally clustered together. A spokesperson pointed out that St. Mark Parish is a large parish, so statistically, yes, you're going to have maybe more people there who might abuse. Did you uncover any evidence that there was intentional clustering of abusive priests?
No, I don't think so. But we did see that phenomenon, and it fed upon itself. I mean, it made it easier for the new guy to come in and start committing abuse. If there were already people in that particular parish, the child would often go to another priest or somebody else in the parish, and you know, they were reporting abuse to another child abuser.
David, you guys were the victims in this. Do you think the clustering was coincidental?
No, no, I don't think so. What we've seen, the pattern throughout the United States is every diocese has had clusters of things like that happen. We know that they put priests into parishes of poor or rural areas. to get them away from people who more likely would report them. You know, a wealthy parish, people who are well-to-do, the children might feel safer to report the priest. We also know, I mean, something really devious that came out in the Pennsylvania grand jury is priests were actually giving, abusive priests were actually rewarding children with these little medallions. And if a child wore that medallion, it tipped off other priests who were abusive, and they knew that that child could be victimized, and they knew that he was an easy target.
However, I'll speak up. While my personal experience was with the Keogh school, at the same time, 2 of my younger brothers were altar boys at St. Mark's with one of the most vicious pedophiles there. But I will say that one of my brother's best friends committed suicide while he was a very young boy. So, and it was a relatively well-to-do parish. And this happened to families, you know, Catholic families that we were all taught that priests were God. You know, you must follow whatever the priest tells you to do. This is what a good child does, is follow the direction of the priests and the nuns. Whatever they tell you to do, that's how we were raised. We were set up to be victims of these pedophiles.
I wonder how you feel, because am I hearing anger? Is it still primarily anger?
It's anger, yes. To be honest, it's very much anger. My family's torn apart. My family's torn apart. I have family members that just say, get over it, just get over it. You know, and there's many families out there that are just like that. So for many families out there, please, you know, support each other. It's important that you do.
I think it's important to understand, people do say get over it. They say get over it. If I were to come in and chop off your leg, nobody would say get over it, right? But you can't see this injury, right? Nobody'd say, okay, I'm walking around without a leg and I'm crippled and I'm gonna be crippled for life. And everybody said, well, nobody would say just get over it. But in this case, because you can't see the injury, I mean, it's deep down in your soul. I mean, some people have described it as soul murder, right? People need to understand that you don't just get over that. It's a lifetime sentence that you've been left with. And some people, depending on, you know, what family support or whatever, their particular circumstances, and I don't totally understand why some people get through it better than others. I'm not laying blame or anything like that, but you never get over it.
So David, as Attorney General Brian Frosch spearheaded this investigation to get us really where we are today, what did you want to ask him?
Well, I want to understand, I want to know how far we're going to go with the other 2 dioceses, right? We have 2 dioceses. We have the Wilmington Diocese, which covers all of the Eastern Shore in Maryland. And then we have the Washington Diocese, which covers 5 counties in southern Maryland, 5 or 6 counties in southern Maryland. How far are we on those investigations, and is there a chance that we could expect the report soon? And I know you're not in the driver's seat anymore.
Correct.
But how far, in your opinion, did those investigations go?
I can't get into detail. I think Attorney General Brown has already said the materials have been subpoenaed. The subpoenas have been out there a while. He is getting a bunch of additional employees in this budget that's just passed, starts July 1st. I'm hoping that he can take some of those resources and put it on those cases and finish them up faster than we did the Archdiocese of Baltimore. I'm sorry that the Archdiocese of Baltimore investigation took as long as it did. I wish that we had done it a lot faster.
Yeah, and I guess the reason I'm anxious to do that, as Gloria said, you know, there are people who have taken their life over this, and we are all getting older. And this woman's sister passed away. We can't undo that. We can't soothe their soul unless we get this information out. And people are dying, and we need to get it out soon.
I do want to acknowledge, Gloria, back in 2018, this is a re-meeting of sorts that you were calling on Mr. Frosch as Attorney General to get into this. And I know that there's a political element, there's a religious and legal element. I also see your yearbook right in front of you from, is it 1972? And I just realized this woman sitting in front of me was a girl at that time.
Right.
And how does it, anything 4 years later that you would say to Mr. Frosch? Because I know it took a long time. He's acknowledged that. Anything you'd like to say?
First, I'd like to say thank you for sticking with it. I'd like to say thank you for having the Richard Wolff to work with you, because that man is the reason I believe you have, as the investigator, when he interviewed me and the other survivors, he was incredibly thorough, but he was incredibly kind. And he was able to get real information from us, that from the experiences that were horrendous, that no one should ever have to talk about, but he was incredibly kind. So I felt safe in talking to him. I will tell you, though, that those 4 years cost me greatly, and there were some very dark times during those 4 years.
I'm so sorry, Gloria. I wish we had done it faster. And I appreciate your complimenting Rich Wolff. He's an outstanding investigator. I want to give a shout out also to Elizabeth Embry, who was the attorney who led the investigation, who's now a member of the House of Delegates.
Yes, she was great. Yes. We did a grassroots effort on getting people to reach out, because you didn't have enough money to do the advertising to get people to know that there was even this investigation going on. So we used a young Facebook to let people know that there was even this investigation starting. So we reached out to Keough graduates and other schools that we knew would be in St. Mark's, other schools that we knew it was important to reach out to. So it started.
May I just say one thing? Keough had two of the worst monsters in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Messrs. Maskell and Magnus. Dozens and dozens of children horribly abused by these people who threatened with murder and killing their families and all kinds of terrible stuff. So I just can't imagine what it was like being a student at that school.
Brian Frosch, Gloria Larkin, David Lorenz, thank you so much for joining us and being a part of our panel.
Thank you.
And we should point out yet again that Archbishop William Lori denied our repeated invitations to join us here tonight and to have a say, and the Archdiocese declined to make any official that they have available to join this discussion, this session of accountability in some ways. But the Archbishop has made some limited public statements.
We're going to play some of that for you as we talk candidly about the Church's response. You're watching a special production from Scripps News, WMAR2 News, and the Baltimore Sun.
It took 4 years of a grand jury investigation and more legal battles in court to expose the reality of the Archdiocese of Baltimore's devastating history of abuse and cover-ups. At least 600 victims raped, sexually abused, even tortured by at least 156 priests.
The Maryland Attorney General's report detailing what happened is finally out. In just a couple of minutes, we'll be joined again by some of the victims of these horrendous crimes. But first, we want to bring back in some of the journalists who've been fighting for the truth. Lee Sanderlin and Jean Marabella are the reporters from the Baltimore Sun. Jean, you've been at the Sun since 1987. I've been here for 20 years at WMAR. How stunning. I know it was hard for me to read it. It was very graphic, it was very hurtful, it was very painful. You're feeling for the victims, for the survivors. How stunning was it for you, knowing that the Catholic Church is such a big part of Baltimore and the people here who that is their faith?
Yeah, like you, I just can't find the words sometimes. And since you've been here for decades as well, you knew all these people. You knew Cardinal Keeler. You know, you knew William Borders maybe. I think O'Brien was after Keeler. So it's all very familiar. And I thought I was prepared to read this because we've been through all these, you know, with it happened in Boston. There was that famous movie Spotlight about how the Boston Globe uncovered rampant sexual abuse there. We went through the Pennsylvania report. But when it's your own state, there's something, you know, you pass by these churches every day. And it's just horrifying. I've met a lot of the victims, and your heart just breaks for them. They're now in their 60s, 70s, and still the memories are so vivid.
And so, Lee, Archbishop Lowry was not Archbishop during this time. He said that he was horrified, he was apologetic, committed to support the victims. Take a listen to some of what he had to say to the Baltimore Sun this week.
I think that my hope and prayer is that this report will contribute to bringing some closure to those who were harmed. But apology and prayer, while good, is not enough. And so the third part is called action. And it describes what the Archdiocese has done from 1985 roughly until the present time.
Now, he declined repeated invitations to be with us tonight, and no one from the Archdiocese would join us either. What do you make of their response, or I guess I could say lack of response?
Well, I want to key in on something he just said. Action from 1985 onward. There are examples throughout this report after 1985 of the church leaning on police officers and prosecutors to make cases go away, to one of the most notorious, horrible examples in this report is a father by the name of Joseph Mike, and he tortured children. And the church clearly knew about this and did not bring the full case to authorities. Again, a father, Robert Newman, I believe this was 1987 in Baltimore City, he admitted to his superiors to abusing more than 100 children. And the church told authorities about one, and the state's attorney's office declined to bring charges in that case. In the 90s, there was a woman who said that she had been raped as a 15-year-old by a father, Kenneth Faribaugh, and the church sent their attorney to talk to her, and then she changed her story and didn't want to be contacted anymore. And then when Father Faribaugh died, some years later, he died while under investigation by the Harford County Sheriff's Office, and throughout that investigation, I believe this was 2000, 2002, somewhere in there, the Sheriff's Office, a lieutenant in that Sheriff's Office was informing the Archdiocese about the status of their investigation. So sure, things changed radically in 2002 when the Boston Globe published their stories and the church got caught and they didn't have a choice. But you know, 85 to 2002, a lot of this was still happening. The cover-up was still before us, I would say.
Lee Sanderlin, Jean Marbella, both of the Baltimore Sun, thank you so much. You guys have been on this for years. Scripps News, WMAR 2. All of us are going to stay on this for, like you said, accountability with the Archdiocese here in Baltimore. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. Where do we go from here? It's a crucial one for the people who have been living this story for generations. What can we do to support them?
What do they want us to know about their experience? Survivors of these crimes rejoin us here in Baltimore next. This hour, we've talked about the horrific top-line numbers of this Attorney General's report into the Archdiocese of Baltimore. 600 victims, over 60 years, and a cover-up by the church. But there are other figures you really cannot see, you cannot measure.
The countless lives destroyed, the relationships destroyed, the paths to healing that will last a lifetime, where Honored to be rejoined by some of our courageous survivors of these crimes, Jean Hargadon-Weiner, Gloria Larkin, and Teresa Lancaster joining us back. Thank you so much for joining us for this whole hour, sharing your stories. What would you like for the takeaway to be for this? What would you like to see happen? Because we've seen the legislation. What more would you like to see?
I think for me, one of the things is that that there will be hotlines or places people can call because it can be very upsetting. So we do know SNAP has a hotline that that they have encouraged people to call if they were to need 1-877-762-7432. Also, RAIN is another one. This is very important because you know how it felt. You just had media sit here and talk about how it felt to read that report. Well, people are reading it, and it's not just that it is a disgusting group of events. It's about us. And so someone who went to a school and they see a priest's name, and then they, all of a sudden, it can stir memory. It can make things move. I think we need to, as a community, be prepared to have people know where they can call, because that to me is, I don't want them calling the Archdiocese of Baltimore. I want them calling some other group that will have people in place. RAIN does have the opportunity to give psychologists, you know, they will offer people close by. That's one of the things I would like that we put out more on Facebook and all those things.
And Teresa, you had mentioned the appeal.
Yes, I would ask that the church does not appeal the constitutionality of our new law that the governor just signed today. They've made it known that they're going to appeal the statute of limitations. And this is an issue I've been working on since the 90s. And I'm asking them not to say it's not constitutional, because I believe it is.
Gloria?
I would ask the church not to claim false bankruptcy. They have plenty of money to pay the survivors and their families. You know, and one of the worries that I have is that those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. And I know that we all hope that this is not happening now. But one of the other expectations I have is that the demand is that not just the Archdiocese, but every school, every organization, the Boy Scouts, everyone, they're mandated to report to authorities, to the police, to social workers, to people who can help any child abuse. Not that they report it internally to their own people, which is what the church did. And nothing can, when you self-report internally, that's how the church damaged so many children.
Thank you to Teresa and Jean and Gloria. David, who was here before, we know you guys are not here because you even want to be here. You're here out of a sense of duty, it seems, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be back with some final thoughts. Stay with us. Back now to close out what has been a horrifying, painful, and revealing hour about how the Archdiocese of Baltimore covered up generations of sex crimes and abuse. For our viewers with the tie to Baltimore, if you or someone you know was abused, the Maryland Attorney General's office wants to hear from you. Their phone number is on your screen, 410-576-6312, or email report@oag.state.md.us.
And this conversation can bring up a lot emotionally. Know that help is available right now, especially if you're struggling with your mental health. Dial 988 and you can speak with someone right now.
Our thanks to our panel of guests this hour, the victims, the investigators, and the journalists. The Archdiocese of Baltimore pledges it operates differently now, even if it declined our repeated invitations to join us here tonight.
Alongside Kelly Swoop of WMAR 2 News, I'm Chance Seals of Scripps News. Thank you for joining us for this special presentation.